Welcome, everybody, to today's talk. My name is Nikki Meng, and I'm the founder of Friends Indeed Gallery. We are broadcasting today from my son's bedroom. So Friends Indeed Gallery is a absurdly small art space in San Francisco's historic Chinatown and financial district. We're launching our new talk series, which is called A to Z Artists at Large, focused on Asian diaspora at our new location, aka the ether of the internet. So welcome everybody here. I'm introducing today Aleesa Alexander, Soleil Ho, and Shih, who will be in conversation about art, food, and politics. Aleesa Alexander is the assistant curator of contemporary American art at the Cantor Center at Stanford University. She has a large focus on contemporary art from the Deep South, and also she is working on a greater initiative to be announced at Stanford, which has to do with Asian American diaspora. So, Aleesa is also a graduate of University of Santa Barbara in the PhD program, and was priorly at the Met before that. Soleil Ho is restaurant critic for the SF Chronicle and host of its podcast, Extra Spicy. She was also formerly the host of the multiple award-winning podcast, Racist Sandwich. Shih was born in 1986, is a Taiwanese-American artist exploring concepts of home, not just as a physical space, but also as culture, generational, and emotional spaces we inhabit. Right now, she has a show with Periton Gallery called Same Same, which includes 2 new bodies of work from an ongoing series about shared nostalgia and the Asian American pantry. So I wanted to thank our speakers for being here today, and for Janet Liu for hosting the chat room. Today's talk will largely be moderated by Aleesa Alexander, and then towards the end, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So feel free, if you have any questions that pop up, to just write them down in the chat room, and we'll address them towards the end of the conversation. So I pass it off now to Aleesa.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna share my screen here. I could not help but make a PowerPoint. That was not necessarily in the original plan, but pictures are great. And obviously we're here talking about art, so we have to have some pictures to look at. So I just wanted to show folks some works from Stephanie's current show that's going to close here at Periton Gallery. It's called Same Same, and it's all of these amazing hand-built, I believe, right, versions of soy sauce from around the world. And you can go to the website and check it out there. Of course, I had to put the Healthy Boy brand in there because that was the one that was in my household. This is one of my favorite things about Stephanie's work, that when I reached out to her, I think it was, a year and a half ago, because there's such a visceral reaction for a lot of us who grew up with so many of these pantry items, to see them represented in such a way. When you're an art lover and a food lover, there's something that is really just hits home in a unique way about this work. So this is her newest body of work, and so I thought I'd throw back to some of her older, quote unquote older, because actually, Stephanie, you haven't been practicing for a super long time, which is amazing when you look at the skill that is required to create these objects. That you wouldn't know that necessarily. But we have grass jelly, we have the OG black vinegar, which really got the conversation started. This is the one that I have to shout out that I have. As you can see, I did say that I liked it very much, but Mama is the instant noodle brand of Thailand. It's like the unofficial instant noodle brand of Thailand. And I loved this one in particular because even though it was broken, it reminded me of like a kind of postmodern ruin that you would find somewhere. So I actually loved that this one was broken. Stephanie, you've received a lot of attention for your work, I think rightly so already, because of the reasons that I just mentioned, in the way that it does hit a certain register for those of us who are either immigrants or the children of immigrants from the Asian diaspora. And here I just want to point out that Soleil has, has written about you before in this article here from Thrillist. So the three of us have all been able to connect prior to this, which is partially what made me so excited to participate in this conversation, because we all found our ways to each other somehow already before today. Lately, what I've really been enjoying that I hope we can talk about more is a lot of your work around activism. There's been this great Grub Street Diet article in New York Magazine that Stephanie talks about. I mean, it's supposed to be ostensibly like a food diary for the week, but it's really a diary of you going through the protests, right, around the George Floyd protests that were really rising up at the time. I mean, they're ongoing, right? But so it's both a food diary, but also kind of an activist protest diary as well. And then here, this is sort of your little pandemic portrait kit, which I love also. So moving to talk about Soleil. Soleil is a really wonderful and welcome addition to the Bay Area. I mean, I'm new myself, and Soleil is new, just arriving in January of 2019. Taking over as the food critic from somebody who previously held the post for like 30 years or something, right, Soleil? It's a very long time, completely rethinking how we approach, how this newspaper approaches food writing and journalism and reporting. And, you know, you took away the star rating, which I love because it's sort of anti-hierarchical. Like Mickey said, you're the host of this wonderful podcast through the Chronicle called Extra Spicy. You've received also a lot of really wonderful attention about your criticism already, which I always love to shout out. And this is from Glamour Magazine, Women of the Year from the end of last year. And who doesn't love a dog in a portrait, right? And you were also nominated for a James Beard Award for your writing recently. And so I really encourage everyone to go read Soleil's work, because what I love about it is that it's not just about food per se, but it's all about all the politics, the structures, the social issues, the production, climate change, everything that goes around food and the production and the creation of food in restaurants. She really does this wonderful thing where she exposes the framework of this industry in a way that can often seem rather opaque to a lot of us. And in that way, I think that there is an interesting connection that leads me to my first question to ask both Stephanie and Soleil, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And that is about this role of activism, because I think when you say a ceramic artist or a food critic, most people would not necessarily associate that with a kind of socially minded orientation towards the world. And yet that's really what you do. You bring, it's not an addendum to your practices, at least in my mind, in the way that I see it. It's really right at the core. So I'd love to hear more about the roles that you see activism playing in your respective practices.
So for me, I feel like it's really hard to separate my activist self from my artist self, because they are both just two sides of the same coin. So I agree with what you're saying, Aleesa, that it's hard to separate, because I don't see how one part of my life can't flow into the other part. And so it's just been a really natural transition me to start using my platform on Instagram, for example, as a platform both for my art and for the social causes that I care about.
Yeah, you have Stephanie has one of the great Instagram accounts, because I was really, especially when the protests were happening, I loved seeing really valuable content from the front lines that you were posting, and that I really appreciate it. So I encourage everybody to follow Stephanie, if not for that reason, then all the myriad of others. But yeah, Soleil.
Yeah, so I guess for me, the interesting thing that I've tried to tease out in the past year of being the food critic is, you know, you hear the constant refrain of like stick to sports or stick to food when you are writing about it or covering it or participating in those fields. And for me, like I would tend to agree with Stephanie. For me, it's the language is less about separation and more about exposing, right? Like exposing the sort of cultural like ideologies and politics within the food world that we just consciously separate because we are taught to separate production and labor from product. You know, I think that for me, like the conscious act of reintroducing context, like we did with the colonial story, right? Reintroducing the context of imperialism and history into this aestheticized restaurant experience was disturbing for a lot of people and was actually construed as a political act, but really it was just, bringing it to the forefront, whereas it was sort of hidden behind the wallpaper.
Yeah. Would you mind just saying a little bit more about that review for those of us, or for those who haven't read it?
Yeah, so Le Colonial is a Frenchy Vietnamese restaurant that opened here, I believe, in the late 80s or early 90s, sort of in confluence with this really interesting mini movement of interest in French Indochina through film and literature in the US and in Europe. And so it touches on that aesthetic, right? Like there's palm trees and there is like old, like antique furniture. And even in the copy for the website, it's supposed to bring you back into the sort of luxurious, exotic environment of French colonial Vietnam. And, the premise of the review was just, who wants to go back there? It's kind of like the same idea behind people who say that the 50s were just a wonderful time of family values and like romance and whatever, but for who, right? And so that was just a basic question that I wanted to posit. How do we complicate this, and how do we not even just complicate it, but just remind people of like what this is about? Because and just demonstrate through the act of like aestheticizing history, we tend to tell a very particular story, and I just wanted to help kind of bring out that story. Like what are they trying to say, and how can we react to it?
Yeah,
and the food is bad.
I feel like, and the food is bad. It's not that Soleil and I are bringing activism into the spaces that we're working in. It's that the politics are there inherently, right? Art is inherently political. Food is inherently political. And so the people who get mad at that, I think they're wanting to see the world through rose-colored glasses, right? It's not that Soleil is talking about something that is irrelevant. It's that it's easier and more comfortable not to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of folks whose worldviews are not used to understanding just how these things are so intricately intertwined, it is kind of, it's a difficult sort of moment and realization when you do start reading this material, and when you do start looking at art through in this way that it is omnipresent, I think, to the three of us. I wonder if either of you have received any, I know that I've just from reading any backlash or any kind of comments in terms of saying, why is this always so political? When to me, everything that we do and all the choices that we make and the things that we create and consume, those are all political and social gestures. But have you, as artists and critics and writers, have you felt this as well?
I have been surprised at how few trolls that I've had, actually, especially as I've talked more about my work. Like lately, I've been a little bit more open about the fact that when I started the dumplings, I was really trying to capitalize on this fetishization of me and my art by white viewers, right? I was like, I think that white people will love to pay money for a dumpling. I think this is a way I can make a living. Like, I was really thinking about it as a commodity, right? So I'm surprised that in saying that, or in talking about,
I just wanted to share that while you were talking about it.
In talking about the white gaze and like microaggressions that I've heard around my work, that I haven't had more pushback from white viewers on what I'm saying. But what I have gotten a lot of pushback on is anytime I post anything about socialism or about Karl Marx, people get very angry. Which was not necessarily what I expected. I didn't think that, this will be the most controversial thing that I'm saying or that I'm making. But we live in very polarized times.
Right. Soleil, what about your experience?
I only check my email on Mondays.
You told me that. That's a good practice.
And that helps. It makes it really hard to do other things, but there's just a lot of feedback that I get from subscribers or just from people they send stories to. Yeah, I think there have been a few people, even now, who insist that I take the politics out of my writing. But as we just talked about, right, like it is intrinsically a part of it. And I also have never pretended that I will not talk about these topics. And so it's kind of just like, usually I just direct people to Yelp. It's like, it's hard to imagine as a writer, who has been working for however many years, what my writing would be like if I didn't have that consciousness. It's really weird to think about. And truly, I think I would write without that consciousness if I didn't care. If I didn't care about the topic, if I just wanted to say this taco was good, the service was nice, the bathroom was clean, the end, right? Right. But the point of reading, the point of even seeking out food writing is that you want a perspective. You want to hear someone or listen to someone or read someone just talk at length about this really, a kind of esoteric topic. Not many people have much to say about food beyond the fact that it's delicious or not delicious, right? And there are many people with many different angles on that, on strategies, on like how to describe the singular thing, how to describe a bowl of rice. Like you ask 10 food writers and they'll all have different, takes on it. I think, if there are so many people in this field that are doing so many different things with it, like people can find someone that they like, and there's such a glut of this content on Yelp and on Instagram that if they don't like what I do, they can certainly find alternatives.
Right. There's something really interesting about the difference between Soleil and my audience, right? Because I think that people understand that anything that I'm saying is my own personal perspective, but because Soleil is ostensibly speaking for the San Francisco Chronicle, she is more of a public figure in people's minds, right? Like, I think people allow themselves to take what she's saying personally, whereas I think I kind of skate by on just being this just an individual artist.
Yeah, no, there's a funny thing that happens too, because, you are a producer of work and I am someone who is supposed to have taste and determine what is good and what is not, right? Apparently I'm supposed to have taste. And the thing about taste is that if you disagree with somebody about whether or not X thing is good, there's a chance that they might take that personally as an insult, right? Because for some, taste is their personality. So when you come in sort of guns blazing, like I did, and you introduce all these things that people aren't used to, and you evaluate, X, Y, and Z based on criteria that they're not used to, it seems like an affront. It seems like you're attacking them. It's like this culture war thing that we're seeing play out in so many different avenues. I think that's a really interesting difference between us too, where I'm supposed to make choices for other people about art.
Right. I totally, I feel you on that regard, because I feel like also as somebody who's associated with an institution and who also deals with this idea of taste, right? That it's something that people can and do take very personally, and to come in and challenge, because taste is to a certain extent subjective, and we all bring to your writing, for example, Soleil, to my curatorial work, we bring to it certain perspectives and experiences that inform, quote unquote, our idea of taste. And so now we're in this moment when there are different folks who are entering these spaces, like you're entering the Chronicle, or myself, like in a museum space, where we bring with it our own informed taste and judgment, right? That is not necessarily the hegemonic norm that we have been seeing since time immemorial, right? And it is unsettling, because I think that there has been a tacit acceptance for so long on what constitutes good taste. And it makes me think about the review that you wrote for Shih, right? That you really came in guns blazing into the Bay Area to take on Shih right from the beginning. But this idea that nothing is off limits, right? That there's no institution too esteemed to be held to the standard of evaluation that we should be able to hold to everything. So I think this idea of taste is a really interesting one in this current moment. And it's interesting to see how it relates between art, right, and food, and artistic practice.
No gods, no masters.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that there's something interesting that's happening with what Soleil is doing in coming for these institutions, right, and thinking about gatekeeping. And then it's something that I think about a lot as somebody who doesn't have formal art training. I don't have a BFA. I don't have an MFA. And for a lot of art institutions and galleries, that is an assumed thing that you need just to get into the door. And so, yeah, it's just a complicated issue that I am glad that we're starting to contend with.
I mean, you've been so successful in such a short time, and yet I assume that that has been somewhat of an impediment, right? When trying to break into the quote-unquote mainstream gallery art world, have you found that your lack of formal training or whatever has been some cause for concern?
No one has ever said that, but I certainly have my suspicions as to certain responses I've gotten to applications or interviews or whatever.
And I think it's worth noting that for those who don't know you, I mean, you're really a kind of one-woman deal, because you are the one that is making by hand, right, every single one of these objects. And I know that they're very time-consuming, and I could easily see that somebody working at a different level in terms of like a blue chip gallery or a certain artist from an MFA program would end up having studio assistants to really help you build up this massive body of work. But I think there's something really significant in that you're the one who's creating everything in your oeuvre, right?
Yeah, with the one exception, which is that for the Periton show, because the timeline was so tight, I hired someone to help me roll out 700 dumpling skins in porcelain clay. I tried to teach her how to fold the dumplings themselves, but it turns out that, everyone has their own particular way of folding a dumpling. And it hadn't really occurred to me, since all my dumplings basically looked fairly similar, that's not something you could have somebody else do, right? It's a part of you, it's part of your signature. And so she rolled out all these skins and she cut them into like 3.5-inch circles. But then I still had to fold each one.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be a Stephanie Shih dumpling, right? Because everybody does learn to fold a dumpling in a certain way. Sort of brings me to my next question. I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep flipping back and forth between images. Speaking of dumplings here. And these beautiful bags of rice that you created. I don't want to ascribe too much to it necessarily, but I think it's worth talking about is the idea of Asian Americanness and, our own positions in the world, and thinking about how have your positions and our positions as Asian Americans from very different backgrounds and stories and parts of the diaspora. How has this affected your practices, or do you see it informing it? And in what ways do you kind of not? In what ways might it be overly reductive, or in what ways might it be, accurate to think about your practices in relation to your own identities?
So for me, I think of it kind of the way we were talking about politics, right? How it's hard to separate your political self and your activist self from your artistic self. For me, I can't separate being Asian American from my identity. And so when I'm making personal work, it necessarily is work about my Asian American experience. Yeah, no,
I feel the same way. And I've certainly had a lot of anxiety about being too, leaning too hard into Asian stuff, or thinking too much about Asian frames of reference also, as someone who grew up going to Chinatown every weekend in New York, and someone for whom Vietnamese food was the default for most of my childhood. The things that I use as comparison, right? For texture, for flavor, the palate is very much informed by that upbringing. And so, when you're thinking about, when you're just publishing online, it doesn't really matter what your audience is, because they can be anybody, right? But when you're publishing in print, your audience is really regional. They're united by that and other sorts of class, race sorts of things that I didn't necessarily opt into. And so you're grappling with these questions of who your audience is constantly. And oftentimes the assumed audience is a white person, and I had to kind of make the choice early on, do I care? Or do I not care? And I realized that using those frames of reference, right, comparing a pastry to bao, or comparing, you know, all these sorts of other like flavors to the flavors you might find in fish sauce, like those are also political acts. Those are also acts that sort of just like stake a flag in my Asian Americanness and my specific like Vietnamese Americanness, as just sort of a not so subtle way of saying like, this is my frame of reference and everyone has a frame of reference.
This is valid as, you know,
right.
frame of reference.
Yes. And I think just to point it out means, I think for me, the thing I've been grappling with was just how do you point out whiteness? Because pointing it out, right, it's like naming Rumpelstiltskin, because that is what kind of saps it of its power when you pull it out of its default and pull it out of the shadows. So in that way, I'm trying to model ways in which we can just talk frankly about what we consider to be default, and by changing like really subtly what I use as default, I can sort of jostle that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So who do you feel that you are writing for when you imagine your reader, Soleil?
I am writing for my mom a lot of the time, who is like a foodie and who is pretty cosmopolitan and also knows what I'm talking about. And she has like intellectual, sorry, there's people talking, but she has intellectual curiosity about food too. And that's who I want to talk to. It's just people who are willing to Google, because I've had to Google many terms, even while sitting in restaurants, and I don't feel ashamed of it, and no one should.
And do you feel like you were always writing for her, or do you think that there was a time when you internalized the default white reader and then had to break out of that?
You know, I think there are certainly times when I do. But, you know, I did a lot of reading too. I think the thing that really shook me out of that was going to graduate school to get an MFA in writing, which I dropped out of. So I also am degreeless like you. It just radicalized me to that, because in the workshops, I noticed how other writers were doing it, right? I was one of the handful of writers of color in the program. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. This is terrible, right? Like it really exposed audience to me. So yeah, no, I mean, it didn't stick very long.
Yeah, I feel like it was with this project that I finally was able to break out of the assumption of the white gaze. It was the first time that I said, no, I'm going to deliberately make work for an Asian audience, because I'm making work, you know, the project kind of started about my childhood pantry. And if the people who understand and relate to my childhood pantry are also Asian American, then I want this project to be for them. What does this project look like when it no longer is concerned with the white gaze? And so it's kind of funny. Now when I make something, I know the pieces that are going to go quote unquote viral, because it's the ones that have crossed over from Asian culture also into mainstream American culture, right? Like sriracha, or like Lao Gan Ma chili crisp. And white viewers love to be like, I know this one. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like, I think they want the recognition. They want to say like, oh, I am worldly enough to also know about this product. And that's fine, but that is not like my intended or desired reaction, and doesn't affect me that much, I guess.
Well, that leads me to this other question that I had for both of you, which is about sort of subject and picking subjects. And I know for a while, Stephanie, that you had this really awesome crowdsourcing model of picking your next subject that you were going to create. And now I know we're looking at 2 bags of rice, right? And so there's obviously decisions in terms of what you're choosing to create, what brands you're choosing. And then on your side, Soleil, you know, of course, how do you choose what to review? You know, you're one person. What do you choose? What are you looking for? And like, what kinds of stories are you drawn to in your own writing? So the idea of subject, right?
So I still use the crowdsourcing method. So all of the pieces, all of the soy sauces that I made for Periton, which is 30 in total, but right now only 16 are part of the show. All of those were crowdsourced. I wanted to find as many different versions of soy sauce from across the Asian American diaspora as I could. Eventually, I think I got soy sauces from 13 different countries. And so a lot of the soy sauces in that exhibition are ones that I've never used before. I don't know what they taste like. I don't know how you cook with them, but I wanted to explore this idea of how multifaceted the Asian American diaspora is.
Awesome. Yeah, there's quite a swath there that ones that I also wasn't familiar with as well, brands of soy sauce I wasn't familiar with as well.
Yeah, for me, that's a complicated question because I also I struggle with like choice paralysis, even when I'm looking at like a dim sum menu, I just like freak out for a little bit and then have to deal with that. I have to process my feelings. But for me, it's a matter of, like I get a lot of tips from readers who are going out and just want me to cover a place that they love or that they hate even. People want to narc on restaurants to me, which whatever. Again, that's why I read emails on Mondays only. So for me, it's like, I do have to be mindful of the places that I am choosing. I think about the broadness of the audience and I think about, okay, am I leaning too hard on restaurants that have tablecloths? Are there any affordable restaurants that I could be looking at? So in that way, I'm thinking about constantly expanding my idea of like who's reading, because if I assume that everyone I am writing for can afford, $200 for a meal for two, right? Like that isn't going to get me too far, or at least like it's going to really narrow down the types of people who are going to feel anything when they read my work. I mean, I think a good writer can make any sort of meal relatable, but certainly the struggle is a lot hard, it's a lot steeper when you are only focusing on fine dining.
And so, yes, if you're only focusing on fine dining, so would you say that, do you do a lot of research beforehand on terms of like what you end up picking, on like how you end up picking the places that you're focusing on? And because the selection of a place is a choice in and of itself. And, you think about the late Jonathan Gold and like, yes, he was a white man, but he really did what he could in terms of like really highlighting restaurants in LA that maybe another critic would not have highlighted or who would not have talked about. A lot of, places run by immigrants, mom and pop shops that were really about their food from their homeland. So, we're talking about choices as all as kind of these political actions. I imagine that might be a part of your paralysis, because it would also be very paralyzing for me if I were in your position as well.
Oh yeah, like the places that I choose to feature tend to have, there are like material consequences to that coverage, right? There are places where I will cover it and then they will sell out of their thing for the next month or even more. The interesting thing about Jonathan too is that he had scouts. He had people who would go out into the city and try restaurants and tell him, people that he trusted, and tell him where to go. I just had me. So it's a really interesting struggle. And it's also just having to go into communities that I'm not totally fluent with, right? And not totally familiar, and just having to show my ass a little bit, which is fine. That's part of the process. Having like cultural humility and being able to relate, even if I am unfamiliar, like completely unfamiliar with a food, like for instance, Burmese cuisine, I know nothing about, right? But I shouldn't let that stop me from reviewing a place. But at the same time, you're asking, like, what is a review then if you don't know objectively, like, if this is good or bad? But that's a whole other conversation.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. The last question that I have on my side, that of course does have an accompanying slide, is really about the future and, what you two are thinking about in terms of your own practices and the future, your role as an artist, of course, Stephanie, and what future projects you might be working on or expanding the Oriental Grocery Project. And then, of course, Soleil, I loved this article as a fellow SF resident, just like, yes, 100%. This is, where dining seems to be going in certain respects in the city in our COVID age, but also the problems with that. Where you see, what you see like COVID exposing in terms of the restaurant and service industry and our food industry, and what the future might look like from here.
there's a way in which the pandemic made me feel like, oh, groceries are now more relevant than ever, right? I've been saying for a long time, groceries are very intimate, they're very personal. You bring them into your home and you feed yourself and your loved ones with them. And now, especially that groceries and grocery workers are considered essential, they're really top of mind. But at the same time, especially with all the uprisings, making replicas of groceries suddenly felt a little fluffy. Like I kind of battled with, should I be taking on a more overtly political subject? And I think that moving forward, I will do both. I think there are still many groceries that there are yet to be made. I have a very long list of groceries that I want to sculpt and ideas for how I want to ultimately show this body of work, in large scale. But also, like with my pandemic survival kit, I do want to start, I am compelled to address these issues of our times, like capitalism, like the pandemic, like the uprisings in my work.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been interesting, right? Because the pandemic and the protests and everything have turned everything so into a political cartoon. Like you could practically see the labels of like, this is commodity culture, this is capitalism, this is the people, right? Like it's so on the nose to be absurd. And, we're a few months in now and it has continued to be so on the nose as to be absurd, as you have seen with those domes, which are just hilarious.
It feels like we're in a dystopian novel.
Right. Yeah, it's too much.
I mean, right? Like you're saying, it's like the pandemic and the uprising and then the domes. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, the thing about the dome story too is like, I think some people read it as me diminishing this restaurant or trying to put it on blast for doing this thing. But like, really the point is these restaurants, the whole industry is suffering during the pandemic and they're driven to desperation because there is nothing coming to them, right? Like we could be skipping over this whole crisis of so many people being laid off, like millions of people in the restaurant industry are being laid off and without health insurance, besides COBRA, which is very expensive, during a pandemic. But these restaurants don't have a choice either. And there's no social safety net. There's no safety net for undocumented immigrants. So a lot of these places are staying open for takeout just to support those workers because they're part of their family, right? They really want to make sure that they're paying rent and being able to pay for their kids and the bills and everything. It's absurd. And the dome is the literal encapsulation of those issues where this restaurant had very little to go on. Certainly like their GM made a lot of really problematic statements about houseless people. But at the same time, there are many stories like this where these restaurants had literally like nothing, no safety net, no cushion at all. And they're doing increasingly, riskier gambles in order to survive. And they're not going to, and every restaurant is going to be an Applebee's and we're just going to have to be fine with that if we don't get our act together as a country and support people with like universal health care and such things. So yeah, I mean, again, like this pandemic seems to have been specifically crafted. I'm not saying that it's artificial, but it just seems to be a specifically crafted thing to completely expose the ways in which our country is a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about this, but it's so complicated because I see a lot of people on one hand saying, how could you go to a restaurant because, you're putting the workers at risk. You have to stay home. You're just doing it selfishly because you want to have the experience of going out to a restaurant. But at the same time, these workers, if they're working, they're no longer making their unemployment and they work for tips. They don't even make a minimum wage usually, right? If they're tipped workers. And so if you want to support the worker and so you want to go there and tip them, it's just like, now it's just so clear now that there are no correct answers for anything in our current system of capitalism and commodity and consumerism and living.
Right. I mean, to clarify, in California, tipped workers do make minimum wage and then they
Oh,
make tips, but at the same time, it's not enough to live in the Bay Area. So,
yeah. In New York, I think tipped workers make like $4 or $5 an hour.
I just wanted to jump in here and thank all of our speakers. It's 5:45, so I just wanted to invite the audience to participate if they have any questions, to type them in the chat room now. And while our audience is thinking of questions, I have a question for Aleesa, actually, who's not been antagonized yet in this process. So, I just wanted to ask her this one question about, she's a curator at an institution and really has been broadening the idea and revolutionizing the idea of what American art means at an institution. And I'm sort of wondering, Aleesa, as your role as a curator, how you see yourself in all of this. What kind of programs do you feel like have been receptive and along those lines, basically?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question. And, I take my role as somebody with an institutional affiliation, especially at a place like Stanford, very seriously, because there's a kind of responsibility there in that a lot of people, I mean, by definition, a lot of people are not allowed access to a place like Stanford. And then what kind of intellectual property we produce does make a statement. There are stakes in it, right? And so it's similar to Stephanie and Soleil, and this is why I really appreciated being included in this conversation, is that I also cannot separate these more political or social dimensions from my own curatorial practice and historical thinking, because it is not only imbued in like who I am and the experience I've had as a person, but also the way that I think about history. And I think that's why it's important to get people like us in these institutions to say, like, we really need to interrogate the idea of what it means to be an American and who gets classified as an American, like on a political, on a social, on a cultural level, who gets rights. And it also how these histories are visualized, how they are taught, since this is an academic institution at a university, what are we teaching when it comes to American history, and how are we perpetuating white supremacy or supporting certain narratives? But, in my side, how can we upend these narratives? How can we challenge these things that I was taught in school that I just accepted as being, oh, that sounds right. But all these narratives that never included people like my mom, right? People like who had similar types of experiences as myself, and the contributions that they made in terms of the visual culture of the Americas. And so now, being at Stanford, I've definitely pivoted my focus to more Asian American art, in part not just because of who I am, but because I'm in the Bay Area, and this is, like, San Francisco is the place with one of the deepest and richest histories of the Asian diaspora in the United States, and that history should really be properly represented in an institutional space. I know we're in a moment right now when people are like, burn all the museums down, they're terrible, they're awful, which is like, yes, partially true. We are terrible, and we have done lots of awful things, and we continue to do lots of awful things. But, and I said this in another talk, institutions have not brought their full force to bear on histories of underrepresented and marginalized peoples. We have not utilized our full resources and not fully committed our full institutional power to making sure that these stories are equitably represented across spaces. So, like, I'm not ready to burn the museum down yet until we start doing the right stuff on the inside. So, like, that's the way that I'm seeing it in this current moment.
Right. Soleil, this is an earlier question for you. Someone from the audience wanted to know what the podcast Extra Spicy is about.
Yeah, so it is a interview-based podcast where my co-host Justin Phillips and I talk to people who are in the Bay Area and elsewhere about food and their relationship to it. So we've talked to chefs, for instance. Our latest episode will be with one of the Oakland A's players about the food that he eats during quarantine, which is also really funny and interesting because I know nothing about sports, but it's an interview show.
Okay, so this question is from Rose Eveleth. I'd love for you all to talk a bit about how you feel like your fields might change, not change post-pandemic. Restaurants feel like an obvious place that will likely have to shift, but does art change? Do museums change? Or do people just go back to normal when this is all over? How do you keep that from happening when normal can be harmful for so many? Thank you.
I think for me, I'm lucky in that I am a one-woman show, so I don't have a boss, I don't have an office, I don't have any expectations of when I'm supposed to wake up. And so there are many ways in which my day-to-day life has not changed, right? Except for the fact that I can't go outside and I can't see anyone I love. But I've moved my practice into my home, which has been, taken some adjusting. But otherwise, I am just at the will of the people. As long as people still are interested in my work and still want to buy the work, then I am able to keep doing what I do. And I know that that is like a huge position of privilege.
I think that museums do have to change. I'm actually quite happy that museums and institutions are being called out in the manner in which they are in the present moment. I don't recall, and maybe this is just me being not old enough, but I don't recall a point in which so much of the public was so aware of all the problems of museums in terms of board representation and like the way that finances are allocated and positions of people who are in leadership and representation in leadership and what gets decided in terms of being hung on walls and all this stuff. I don't remember a lot of people particularly caring about what museums did. And now people do, and I think that's great because now museums have to answer and be held accountable not only to the board or the insiders, but also to a larger public that wants to know how institutions function and how do they actually represent us. And so if museums want to survive, we have to change, I think, and it's not going to be acceptable. And you see it everywhere, lots of different, there's been lots of different confrontations at prominent institutions. And I really hope that this is a moment in so many respects in this world, but in my small side of the universe, in the museum world, as a force for positive change in the future.
Yeah, what I find really interesting about this moment too is that I've watched so many restaurants get called out on Instagram, and I'm sure we've seen other call-outs about museums and the art world on Instagram. And I noticed that happens because a lot of these workers who have been mistreated at their jobs or just not had a voice can't unionize. They don't have a collective voice in the industry for many reasons, right? That have to do with the other NRA, the National Restaurant Association. So one thing that I hope that will come out of this long term will be more empowerment of restaurant workers and more of an emphasis on restaurant work being a good job that people will want to have and who deserve benefits for doing. So if anything, that's the long-term impact that I hope all of this has on that industry. It's just more of a labor consciousness.
Yeah, I think that goes across the board, right? For all of us, and I think in many different industries and respects, that's something that I think we'd all like to see.
Okay, we have time for one last question. This is from Shreya Karetti. Stephanie, is a choice of ceramic as opposed to other mediums, materials intentional? And if so, what does it mean to you?
I got into clay almost as a form of art therapy. I have a lifelong back condition that means I'm in pain a lot of the time. And so before I started ceramics, I was actually doing indoor climbing quite a bit, using my body in a way that felt very good, but actually was making my body feel worse. And so I became really depressed, actually. And my partner at the time was like, you really need to get out of the house. Like, you love art so much. Like, why don't you use that as an outlet, to deal with whatever it is you're going through physically and mentally. And so I didn't come to clay because I loved ceramics so much, or even because it has such a long history in Asian cultures and art, though now that is very meaningful to me. But clay really was simply a medium. I've heard someone describe it as the fastest route from what is in your head to what is in your hands, right? If you can imagine it, you can kind of sculpt it. which isn't necessarily true with paint or with drawing or some more difficult to work with medium. So I would actually say that I don't have a special connection to clay. It just happens to be what came to me.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this talk, and to Stephanie and Soleil and Aleesa. This is such a great talk. The recording will be available for anybody who missed the conversation, who would like to see it. So have a great rest of the week, everybody. And if you get a chance, please go visit Stephanie's show, Same, which is on the Perrotin Gallery website through tomorrow. So thanks, everybody, again, and hope to see you at the next talk.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.